Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all types of videos revolving around true crime, psychology and education, and welcome to the first instalment of True Crime Week. So every day this week I'm going to be uploading a different true crime video, just as I've had so many comments recently of you guys saying that you want more and more videos, and obviously I wish I could literally upload a video every single day of my life for you guys, but this has taken a lot of prep, a lot of planning and a lot of hard work. But yes, we're going to have a video every day this week at 5 PM, so set your alarms, make sure you have my notifications on so you know when I have uploaded a new video, and I hope you're excited. So for the first instalment of True Crime Week, we're going to be discussing actually a solved Jane Doe case, because I always do these Jane and John Doe cases and I think a lot of you always seem to really not enjoy, but you do feel a sense of peace when you do hear these solved cases, because especially when they've gone unsolved for so long, it's relieving to know that they are still being looked into, still being investigated, and identities can be found all these years later. So for today's video we're going to be discussing the solved case of the Dade County Jane Doe. But before we get started, I'm just going to whiz through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things, and I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice, I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. Now that that's out the way, we should just go ahead and get started discussing the case of the Dade County Jane Doe. On the 28th of September in 1981, a set of human remains were discovered in a wooded area in Dade County, Hooker in Georgia. The remains were found in an isolated rural location not far from the Interstate 24 and State Highway 299. Very little personal information and characteristics were released publicly about the victim, but the remains were identified as being a female of an African American ethnicity, aged at being around 30 to 40 years and standing at around 5'9" tall. Aside from this, not a lot else was released about the victim. She was simply known to the public at the time as the Dade County Jane Doe, and it was believed that she was murdered. And investigators had no updates or breaks in the case for years, and before long 35 years had passed when the case was publicly announced as being solved in 2018. In the year 2012, a man named Samuel Little was apprehended and charged with the murder of 3 women in California in the 1980s. He was in his 40s around the time, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment following damning DNA evidence at the scenes of the 3 murders. He had claimed he was innocent throughout the entirety of his trial, but in 2018 he formally confessed to having committed a total of 93 murders over 19 states in America between the years of 1970 and 2005. Following this confession, the FBI started to investigate each claims in order to be able to confirm the validity, and ultimately they were able to confirm 50 of these as having been carried out by Little. So that's not to say he didn't carry out the others that he confessed to, it was just that they couldn't find any solid evidence to back his claims. And as it would turn out, the murder of the Dade County Jane Doe was one of these crimes committed by Samuel Little. According to him, he had met a woman in a place called Chattanooga, I apologise if I mispronounced that, but it's in Tennessee. He'd met her in a bar on 9th Street in 1981. He'd lured her into his car under false pretenses and then driven her to a quiet area somewhere in Georgia, where he'd strangled her and then rolled her down a large nearby hillside. And because of the location of where the remains of the Jane Doe were discovered and the description provided in Little's confession, authorities were able to start piecing together the potential match of these 2 cases. And authorities had, as a result, ultimately been able to confirm who was to blame for the death of the Dade County Jane Doe victim and how she lost her life, but they still had to work out a way of figuring out her identity. So a little bit of information into Samuel Little himself. So he was born in a place called Reynolds in Georgia in 1940 under the name Samuel McDowell. According to him, his mother had been a prostitute since she was just a young child, and when she'd fallen pregnant with him in her teens, she'd ended up abandoning him, but it was actually believed that she'd actually given birth to him while she was in prison. And as a result, he was raised by his grandmother in Ohio, and aside from this, not much else is known apart from that he dropped out of high school rather young. Throughout his teenage years, he had been committing a number of criminal acts, so these started from things like theft, but then they gradually got more and more severe. He'd been in juvenile detention in his early teen years, but as he grew older, he began to travel about the country committing crimes, and these crimes included everything from fraud, DUIs, rape, armed robbery. He carried out so many different crimes across so many different states, and by the time he was 35, he'd found himself arrested more than 25 times over 11 different states. But the total prison time that he'd served across each of these convictions had only been 10 years. In addition to this, he found himself very narrowly escaping 2 convictions of murder prior to being arrested and sentenced in 2012. And the believed 93 murders that he had confessed to in the more recent years had gone undetected for so long, and many people believed this had been because he had selected his victims carefully. The majority were believed to be sex workers, homeless people, drug addicts, and people that likely wouldn't have anyone to notice if they would suddenly go missing. And investigators noted that a significant number of his victims had also been women of colour, as well as just being people from these vulnerable backgrounds. A huge amount of Samuel Little's victims remain unidentified to this day, and it was also found that a number of the murders he actually confessed to had not been listed at all as homicides at the time, rather things like overdoses and accidents because of where they were found. Investigators found that he would typically beat his victims until they lost consciousness and then strangle them, and because of the lack of initial evidence of foul play and the victims that he would select to attack, all of these murders went unnoticed. On the 9th of October this year, it was announced publicly that the Dade County Jane Doe, the believed victim of Samuel Little, had been formally identified. Because of this account of him meeting one of his victims in Chattanooga in a bar, and the location of where he'd left the remains, investigators were sort of able to narrow down their search. Little also had a tendency while in prison to draw a number of his victims, as when he would talk to the investigators about each of the murders, he would struggle to remember specific dates and specific facts about each of them. He would get a lot of things wrong. Investigators were able to use sketches and professional clay models of the victims and publicly broadcast them in their massive search for the identities of Little's victims. Over a year after the images of the Dade County Jane Doe were released publicly, all of these years after the murder had occurred, a man had contacted investigators claimed to have recognised the woman. He had sent in a DNA sample for comparison, and it had confirmed his suspicions. The Dade County Jane Doe was in fact Patricia Parker, his mother. Patricia Parker was a 30-year-old woman with a young son at the time of her death, living in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The quote that I found on a lot of sources regarding this discovery was provided by a man named Joe Montgomery at a press conference held this year to announce the formal identification of the victim. So he had said, "Her family have been looking for her for 30 plus years, and the comfort in her son to know that his mum didn't leave him and that she was actually killed, and that's how she left his life. That to me was the best part of this case." And I think that this quote really does say a lot for how much the identification of this victim all these years later has had an impact on Patricia's loved ones. Since Samuel Little is already imprisoned on a number of different life sentences, I think that it is unlikely that Patricia's case will ever go to trial, but I do think it is incredible that after all these years she could finally be named and her family could finally be given some answers. Since the identification of Patricia Parker has been so recent, it gives me hope that investigators are still attempting to name each of the unknown victims of Samuel Little, especially since technology is ever advancing, and so I hope that the loved ones of each of these victims will be brought some peace soon. And that is everything I have to discuss today. I always feel weird ending these solved cases, I just never know how to end them, but like I keep saying, I really do find these ones do bring a sense of closure, and I'm so happy for their families that they do have some answers. So let me know if you have any cases you'd like me to add to my research list, leave them in the comments down below. I hope you found this video interesting, and I will see you guys tomorrow for the next instalment of True Crime Week. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.